Osric found the egg on a Tuesday morning, wedged between two collapsed market stalls in what used to be the center of Dunkrow. He almost stepped on it, would have if the mud hadn't made a different sound under his boot, a hollow crack, not a squelch. He stopped, looked down, brushed the ash back with his fingers until the curve of the shell appeared. It was the size of a large melon, dark as iron, warm even in the cold morning air. The rest of Dunkrow was quiet the way burned places go quiet, not peaceful, just empty. 2 weeks ago there had been 400 people here. A tanner, a baker, a schoolhouse with a cracked window. Now there was nothing except foundation stones and the smell of old smoke. Osric was 31. He had been a field surgeon with the Border Levies for 6 years before the war ended and left him without a war to follow. He came to Dunkrow because his sister had lived here. He found her house, found the foundation of it anyway. He did not cry, he had used that up somewhere else. He picked up the egg carefully, the way he used to hold injuries, not delicately, not afraid of hurting it, but with the specific steadiness of someone who understood that dropped things do not always survive. He tucked it inside his coat. It was warm against his ribs. He walked out of the ruins and back toward the tree line where he had made camp the night before. He did not know what kind of egg it was until it hatched 4 days later. It hatched before dawn in the middle of his bedroll, which he had given to it on the third night because the temperature had dropped and he was not sure cold was good for eggs and he had a coat. The sound it made was like a pot boiling over, a fast, wet, cracking rush, then silence, then something small moved inside his coat where it had rolled during the night. He opened his coat slowly. Inside the layers was something the size of a large cat, scaled the same dark iron as the shell, with eyes the color of amber and a tail that kept knocking against his ribs while it tried to orient itself. Osric knew what a dragon hatchling looked like. Everyone in the 5 lowland provinces knew the warlord Drathen had been burning border towns with 3 of them for the last 2 years as a demonstration of what was coming. This was one of those. Had to be. The nest that the Border Levies had destroyed in the campaign's final week. The egg must have survived the collapse, rolled, been buried. He should have been afraid. He understood that in an abstract way. Instead, he felt something he had not felt since before the war, something that did not have a useful name. The hatchling was looking at him with those amber eyes like it had already decided something and was only waiting for him to catch up. "Right," Osric said. He fed it what he had, dried meat mostly. It ate with the focused aggression of something that had been hungry its whole short life, which it had 4 days in a dead egg. He gave it water from his tin cup, and it drank the whole thing and then bit the cup experimentally and left a dent. He named it Soot because of the color and because he was not a man who spent long on decisions like that. He broke camp and started walking east. He was not sure where he was going. East felt right, away from the ruins, toward the lower valleys, toward anything that still had people in it. Soot rode inside his coat for the first 2 days. On the 3rd day, it climbed out onto his shoulder and stayed there, watching the road with the intensity of something that understood very little but intended to understand everything eventually. People they passed on the road stared. One woman screamed. A farmer on a cart yanked his horse sideways into a ditch. A pair of soldiers heading west saw Soot on Osric's shoulder and went for their swords. Osric stopped walking. He looked at the soldiers. "She's 6 days old," he said, "and you have swords." The soldiers looked at each other. They looked at Soot. Soot looked back. She had already learned that stillness made humans more nervous than movement, though she could not have explained how she knew this. The soldiers lowered their swords. They did not put them away. They stepped aside and let Osric pass, watching him go like they were waiting for the part where something terrible happened. Nothing terrible happened. Osric walked east. Soot adjusted her weight on his shoulder and yawned, showing a single row of very small, very sharp teeth. That was the beginning. At the time, it looked like a man walking down a road with a dragon on his shoulder. That was the part you could see. What you could not see was what Soot was memorizing, the sound of his heartbeat, the specific rhythm of his walk. the temperature of his shoulder and the way his breathing changed when he was thinking hard about something. She was 6 days old and she was already building a map, not of the road, not of the land, but of this one human who had picked her up out of the mud and called her by a name and fed her dried meat from his own rations and never, not once, looked at her with fear. She would not forget that. Neither, for different reasons, would the road. The town of Belhaven had not been burned. That alone made it remarkable. It sat at the base of the Greyhorn Pass, too far east to be worth Drathan's reach and too small to be worth his politics. 400 souls, a mill, a market, an inn with a bad chimney that smoked into the common room on cold nights. The kind of place that knew what was happening in the wider world only through the people who passed through it going somewhere else. Osric arrived on a Thursday with soot on his shoulder and a week's worth of road on his boots. The inn was called the Bent Nail, which he appreciated for its honesty. The woman who ran it was named Petra, 50s, short, hair gone grey at the temples, the look of someone who had been unimpressed by large numbers of things for a long time and intended to continue. She looked at Osric. She looked at Soot. She looked back at Osric. "How much damage does it do?" she said. "She bit my tin cup," Osric said, "left a dent. I have ceramic mugs. That should be fine then." She gave him a room. She did not charge extra for the dragon, which he would later understand was less about generosity and more about the fact that Petra had already calculated how much business a man with a dragon on his shoulder would bring through her door and decided the math was favorable. She was right. By the second morning, half of Belhaven had found a reason to be near the Bent Nail. Soot was 3 weeks old now. She was the size of a medium dog, which she seemed to find inconvenient. She kept misjudging distances and knocking things over with her tail, then staring at the fallen objects with the particular indignation of someone who does not accept responsibility for accidents they consider avoidable. She had stopped riding on Osric's shoulder because she was too heavy and had started following at his heel instead, which made walking through doorways a specific kind of problem. The children of Belhaven found her first, the way children always find the most alarming thing in any situation and approach it without hesitation. A boy of about 8, named Bevan, walked up to Soot in the market square, looked her in the eye, and held out a piece of bread. Osric started to say something. Soot took the bread. Then she allowed Bevan to touch her nose. Then 3 more children appeared from somewhere and Soot was surrounded, and the look on her face was not the look of something being threatened. It was something much more complicated and much more interesting, something that looked, if you were paying attention, like someone encountering an unexpected answer to a question they had not known they were asking. That evening, Petra put a plate of roasted lamb on the floor of the common room for Soot without being asked, watched the dragon eat it with focused efficiency, and said, "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Osric asked. "What they all are, what Drathans are." She refilled his cup without looking at him. Fire and noise, commands. "She's 30 days old." "Drathan's youngest was breathing fire at 20, Petra said. "I heard it from a man who saw it." Soot looked up from her plate. She did not breathe fire. She had not yet. Osric did not know if this was normal or not. She looked at Petra with those amber eyes and then went back to her lamb with the air of someone who had noted a point and would return to it later. "She's not his," Osric said. "I know," Petra said. "You can tell. His have that look, like they've already decided what everything is for. She still looks like she's figuring things out." He slept well that night for the first time in weeks. He was not sure why. Possibly it was the room. Possibly it was the ceramic mug of something warm that Petra had left outside his door. Possibly it was Soot, curled at the foot of his bed, her breathing slow and steady and strangely grounding, the sound of something alive and close that had chosen to stay. He was starting to understand that the choosing was the part that mattered. He had not recruited Soot. He had not trained her or commanded her or earned her through any particular skill. He had picked her up out of the mud and been steady, and that had apparently been enough for a hatchling dragon to build a world around. This made him feel something he could not fully name, not pride exactly, Mori like responsibility, the kind that sits heavier than pride and does not lift when things go well. The trouble arrived on the fifth morning. A rider came through the Greyhorn Pass from the west. His horse was half dead with riding, and so was he. He pulled up in the market square and started talking before he had fully dismounted. Drathan's forces were moving east, not raiding, moving, with full wings of adult dragons overhead and supply lines and the kind of organized violence that meant he intended to stay wherever he arrived. He was 3 days out. Osric sat on the steps of the bent nail and listened to the rider until the man had nothing left to say. The market square had gone very quiet. People were looking at him, not because he had a plan, but because he had a dragon, and in a world where dragons were the thing coming to kill them, that felt like something, even if no one could say exactly what. Soot pressed her shoulder against his knee. She was looking west, toward the pass, her nostrils moving in that slow, deliberate way that meant she was reading the air. Her tail was still for the first time since he had known her. Whatever she was reading, she did not like it. Osric did not call a meeting. He did not make a speech. He sat on the steps of the bent nail with a piece of bread he wasn't eating, and people came to him, because that is what people do when they are frightened, and someone nearby seems less frightened than everyone else. He was not less frightened, he was just quieter about it. Belhaven had 43 men and women who could be called fighters in any reasonable sense. An old soldier named Henwick, who had fought in the last Greyhorn campaign and kept his sword out of habit. A huntress called Bria, who could put an arrow through a moving target at 200 paces. A miller, a blacksmith, 8 farmers who had held off a bandit raid 3 years ago and never quite stopped being proud of it. None of them had fought a dragon. Osric listened to all of them. He asked questions. He did not pretend to have answers he did not have. When Henwick said they should evacuate, Osric asked where. East was the Thornwood, 60 miles of dense forest with no road. North was the Greyhorn at its worst point. South was 2 more towns that were probably getting the same news right now. Running was a direction, not a plan. Bria said, "What does she know?" She meant Soot. Everyone looked at the dragon, who was sitting at Osric's feet like a very large-scaled dog, still watching the pass. "I don't know," Osric said honestly. "She can smell them. She knows something is coming. I don't know what she thinks about it." "Ask her," Bevan said. The 8-year-old had appeared at the edge of the crowd without anyone noticing, which was a habit of his. "She can't talk," Osric said. "She doesn't need to," Bevan said. "You know what she means. You always know what she means." Osric looked at the boy. Then he looked at Soot. He had, in fact, spent 30 days learning to read a dragon the way you learn to read weather, not through words, but through the angle of her head, the set of her wings, the speed of her breath. She was not his. He had understood for a while that the relationship was the other way around. He was hers, in some sense that had no clean human word for it. He crouched beside her. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes said, "I know what is coming. I have known what it is since I was inside the shell and could hear it outside, far away, the voice signatures of the 3 that serve Drathan, which are not like my voice. They are closed. They were made into weapons the way a blade is made. All the other things burned out of them to leave only the edge." He could not have explained how he understood this. He just did. He straightened up and looked at Belhaven. "She's not going to fight them," he said. "She's 30 days old and they're war adults. That's not a plan, but she knows how they think. She grew from the same kind of egg. That matters." Henwick said, "How?" "Because she knows what they're afraid of." The old soldier looked at him for a long moment. "Dragons aren't afraid of anything." "Everything is afraid of something," Osric said. "The question is what?" They worked through the night. Not with swords, they did not have enough of those. With what Belhaven actually had. Rope and timber and the mill's iron gear mechanisms and 300 jars of rendered pig fat and the specific geographical fact that the Greyhorn Pass emptied into a narrow gorge before opening into the valley. And in that gorge, the walls were 40 feet high and the floor was 30 feet wide. Soot moved through all of it. She watched. When Osric made a mistake in the layout, miscalculated the angle of the rope and timber barriers. She walked to the barrier, nosed it, then looked at him and looked at the gorge wall above it. He understood. He moved it. Bria watched this and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "She's engineering." "She's helping," Osric said. "That's what I said." Petra fed everyone through the night, not because she was asked, because she looked at the people working in the gorge with rope-burned hands, and she understood that you keep people going with warmth and food the same way you keep fires going with fuel. It is not complicated, it just requires someone to pay attention and not stop. By dawn the gorge was ready. Whether it would work, Osric did not know. He had built the plan around what Soot had shown him, filtered through what he knew about how fire behaved in enclosed spaces from his years as a field surgeon watching people who had gotten too close to dragon strikes. He knew how fire traveled. He knew what it did to air. He knew, specifically, that in an enclosed gorge with 40-foot walls, a dragon that breathes fire is also breathing its own fire back. That was the plan, not swords, physics. Soot sat at the mouth of the gorge as the sun came up. She was not a weapon, she was not a shield. She was 30 days old and the size of a large dog, and she had chosen to sit beside the humans who had fed her bread and roasted lamb and let a child touch her nose. That was her choice, nobody commanded it. In the distance, west through the pass, something moved against the sky, 3 shapes, growing. Osric stood at Soot's shoulder. His hands were steady. That was the thing about being a surgeon. You trained yourself to be steady precisely because things were going to get very bad very fast, and steadiness was the only tool you had full control over. He breathed slow. Soot breathed with him. 3 days ago he had been walking east with no destination. Now he was standing at the throat of a gorge with 43 people behind him and a 30-day-old dragon beside him, and a plan that depended entirely on the enemy doing what he thought they would do. He had been wrong before. He hoped very much that this was not one of those times. The first dragon through the pass was the biggest. Osric had expected that. He had not expected the sound, not the roar, which was what stories prepared you for, but the sound before the roar. The deep, pressurized exhale of something that had not met resistance in a very long time and did not understand why it was smelling rope and pig fat and human sweat in what should have been an empty valley. It slowed at the mouth of the gorge. It was called Vren, though Osric did not know this. It was 11 years old enough to have judgment, young enough to still lead with aggression when judgment was unclear. It had destroyed 4 towns. It had never been hurt. It saw the barrier of timber and rope across the gorge floor. It saw the humans behind it, very small, very still, arranged in a line like they intended to hold a position. It saw Soot. It stopped fully. Osric had been counting on this, not the stopping, the looking. Vren looked at Soot the way you look at something that does not belong in a context, and your brain keeps trying to file it under the wrong category. A dragon hatchling, standing beside humans, calm, no chain, no collar, no sign of compulsion, just standing there looking back. Vren was confused by this in a way that was, for a few crucial seconds, more powerful than anything else Vren was feeling. The 2 dragons that followed through the pass flanked to either side. They were younger, less certain, and they followed Vren's pause without fully understanding it. The gorge was quiet except for the sound of the river far below through the eastern wall's cracked stone. Henwick, behind the barrier, did not breathe. Bria had 3 arrows knocked across her fingers. She knew, with a surgical certainty, that arrows were not going to stop an 11-year-old war dragon. That was not what the arrows were for. Vren lowered its head and spoke, not in the common tongue, in the deep registers that Osric could feel in his chest more than hear with his ears. A command, a demand, clear out, leave, the specific communication of something that had never needed to ask twice. Osric did not move. Soot answered. Her voice was small, she was 30 days old and her registers were not fully formed, but she answered in the same deep language, and what she said was not defiance. Osric could not understand the words, but he understood the tone because he knew her. She was not challenging Vren, she was explaining something, calmly, the way you explain something to someone who has forgotten that they had a choice. Vren's head snapped to her, held on her. This was the moment Osric had built everything around, not the fire, not the barriers. This moment. The thing Soot knew that Vren had forgotten, that the closed, weaponized state Vren existed in was not what dragons were. It was what Drasen had made of them. And a 30-day-old hatchling who had never been weaponized, who had spent every day of her life eating bread and listening to humans talk and sleeping beside warmth, was speaking from a place that Vren had not heard from since before the training began. He could see it working. He could see the confusion in Vren deepen into something more uncomfortable, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it. He gave Bria the signal. The arrows hit the pig-fat bladders strung along the upper gorge walls, 20 of them, placed across 300 feet of stone. The fat dropped. The torches Henwick's people were holding at the base of the walls touched it. The gorge walls caught in a sheet. Not dragon fire, not magical, just pig fat and controlled combustion and 40-foot walls that suddenly reflected heat back down into the gorge floor with the efficient geometry of a furnace. Vren reared back, not from the heat, a war dragon at 11 could take heat. From the sound, the enclosed roar of fire in a stone channel was something specific, something that hit the same place in a dragon's chest that a certain kind of sound hits in a human chest, the place where old fear lives. Fire in a closed space, no exit above, the walls bright and howling. The two younger dragons turned and ran back through the pass. Vren held. For 4 seconds, Osric counted. Vren held against the instinct, processing, trying to calculate. Its eyes went to Soot again. Soot had not moved. She was watching Vren with those amber eyes, and she was still, completely still, the way Osric was still when he held her at night. The specific steadiness of something that is not afraid and is not pretending not to be afraid, but genuinely has found a ground to stand on. Vren broke. Not screaming, not panicked, but it backed out of the gorge with the specific deliberateness of something that has recalculated and chosen to leave, which was, in its way, more significant than panic. Panic is just reflex. Choosing to go is a decision. The gorge burned for an hour. The pig fat lasted well, and Henwick's people kept it fed carefully. When it finally dropped, the stone was black and the air tasted of smoke. Belhaven was quiet. Then Bevan laughed, not because anything was funny, it was the laugh that comes out of a person when something enormous releases all at once, and the only available exit is laughter. 2 other people joined him within seconds, and then it spread, and the gorge filled with the specific ridiculous sound of 43 people laughing in a burned black canyon because they were alive. Osric sat down on the ground. Soot lay down beside him. He put his hand on the side of her neck, which was his way of saying something he did not have a word for, and she pressed her nose briefly against his wrist, which was hers. Above them, the sky over the pass was empty. Not for long, he knew that. This was one morning, not a war. Drasen would hear what happened here. He would make different choices next time. But Belhaven was alive. 43 people were laughing in a gorge, and 3 dragons had walked away from a fight. For the first time in a long time, Osric thought, that might be enough to build something on. The messenger from Drathen arrived alone, which told Osric more than the message did. A lone messenger was not a threat, it was a question. Drathen was a warlord, ancient by human standards at 62, and he had not gotten old by refusing to ask questions when the answers became important. Vren had returned to his camp and told him something. Whatever it told him, it had been enough to send one man on a horse instead of a second wave of dragons. The messenger's name was Torval. He was young, nervous, and very professional about both. He handed Osric the message in the common room of the Bent Nail, with Petra in the background pretending not to listen and Soot lying across the doorway like a draft excluder. The message was short. It said, "Name your terms." Osric read it twice. He handed it to Henwick, who read it and said nothing for a long moment. "He's not surrendering," Henwick said. "No. He's negotiating," from strength, he still has 2 working dragons and an army. And we have a gorge full of pig fat and a 30-day-old hatchling, Osric said, so we'd better negotiate well. They sat in the common room for 4 hours. All of them, Osric, Henwick, Bria, Petra, a dozen others who had family in the towns Drathen had already burned. Torval sat in the corner with a cup of tea that Petra gave him, because Petra did not stop feeding people even when she disliked them, and was very clear that her hospitality and her politics were 2 separate things. Osric did not know how to negotiate with a warlord. He had never done it. He had been a surgeon and then a man walking east with no plan, but he knew a few things that turned out to be relevant. He knew that Drathen's war had a cost. 3 dragons were expensive, not in money, in time, years of conditioning, of training, of breaking a creature down to the edge and holding it there. Vren had cost 12 years. What Vren had done in that gorge, chosen to leave, was not just a tactical withdrawal. It was a fracture. You cannot unshow a weapon that it has a choice. You cannot unring that bell. Soot had rung it. The message Osric sent back said 3 things. First, Drathen's current holdings to remain his. No eastern expansion. The towns already burned would be compensated from Drathen's treasury over 10 years, not as punishment, as acknowledgement. Second, no more dragons used against civilian populations. Military engagements, if any, on open ground. Third, open access for a delegation from Belhaven to meet with Drathen's dragon handlers regarding the welfare of the 3 dragons currently in Drathen's service. The third term was the one he expected to break the negotiation. Torval returned the next morning with Drathen's response. The first term was accepted without change. The second was accepted with conditions about border disputes that Henwick said were manageable. The third term had 3 words written next to it in a different ink, darker, pressed harder into the page. Explain the third. Osric wrote back 1 sentence. Vren chose to leave. That is not something a broken weapon does. Something is still in there that you should know about before you need Vren to function and find out it doesn't. He was not sure this would work. He was treating Drathen as someone who cared about his dragons as more than weapons. He might be wrong. Drathen might care only about function, only about military capacity, and a dragon that had showed doubt in a gorge might simply be a liability to be destroyed. But he had spent 30 days watching Soot build a world out of trust. He had watched Vren stop at the gorge mouth and look, really look, at a hatchling who had not been broken. He had seen something in Vren's 4-second hold against the fire instinct that felt less like a weapon calculating and more like something older trying to surface. He could have been reading it all wrong. The negotiation took 2 more days. Torval made 6 trips back and forth through the pass, which he handled with the resigned professionalism of a man who had accepted that his job was going to involve an unreasonable amount of riding. By the end, he was eating dinner at the Bent Nail and having actual conversations with Petra about the political history of the eastern provinces, which she knew very well. The final agreement was signed on a Thursday morning in the market square of Belhaven. Not a permanent peace, neither side was naive enough to call it that. A halt, a space, room to breathe. Osric read the signed document twice, then rolled it up and held it. He felt the weight of it, which was surprisingly light for something that had taken 4 days and enormous amounts of pig fat to produce. Bria was watching him. She said, "What does she think about it?" He looked at Soot, who was sitting in the sun on the far side of the square with Bevan's arm across her back and a look on her face that communicated deep satisfaction with the warmth and mild irritation at the weight on her back and general contentment with the state of the morning. "I think she's fine with it," he said. "Good," Bria said. "She's the one who did most of the work." This was true, and Osric did not argue it. Soot had done what no sword could do, and no speech could do, and no military strategy had ever managed in 2 years of this war. She had stood inside the gorge and spoken to something in Vren that Drathen's 12 years of conditioning had not fully reached. She had spoken to it in the only language that mattered, the language of something that had not been broken, looking at something that had, and saying, "Remember, you were not always this." He did not know what happened to Vren after that. He would find out eventually, but that came later. For now, the market square, the sun, Bevan's arm across a dragon's back, a signed piece of paper, 43 people who had stopped laughing but had not stopped being alive. 3 months after the gorge, Drathan's senior dragon handler came to Belhaven and asked to meet Soot. Her name was Corval, and she had worked with dragons for 30 years. She was not what Osric expected, quiet, grey-haired, with hands that moved the same way Osric's did around an injury, careful and deliberate. She stood in the street outside the Bent Nail and watched Soot cross the square, and she did not show anything on her face, but something moved behind her eyes. She said, "She's 4 months old." "About that," Osric said. "She's larger than she should be at 4 months. She eats well." Corval looked at him. "She's larger than she should be because she's not spending energy on stress. A dragon under constant stress does not grow properly. Drathan's 3 have not grown at their natural rate in years." She paused. "I have been telling him this for 2 years. He does not hear it. He hears battle metrics." Soot came to Osric's side and stopped there, watching Corval with the amber-eyed assessment she gave to new things. Corval held very still. She did not reach out. She let Soot decide. Soot stepped forward and pressed her nose briefly against Corval's hand. Then she stepped back. Corval made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she collected herself and said, "She trusts fast." "She trusts people who know how to be still," Osric said. "You held still. Most people don't the first time." "I have spent 30 years with dragons," Corval said. "Holding still was the first thing they taught me." "Who taught you?" She looked at him. "The dragons." They sat on the steps of the Bent Nail for 2 hours. Corval told him things about dragon development that no human outside Drathan's handlers had ever been told. How hatchlings build their first understandings of the world from the emotional temperature of whoever holds them in their first weeks. How the conditioning that made Drathan's dragons into weapons had worked by replacing that first warmth with a very controlled, very consistent kind of pressure. How Vren, at 11, still had a layer that sat beneath the conditioning, older than the training, built in the first weeks of its life by a handler who had not yet learned to be hard about it. That handler had been Corval. She said this without self-pity, just as a fact that cost her to say. Osric listened. He understood, gradually, what she was telling him. She was not here only about the negotiations' 3rd term. She was here because Vren had come back from the gorge changed in some way she had not seen before, and she needed to understand what had changed it, and she had finally understood that the thing she needed to learn was 30 days old and sitting in the sun across the square. He told her what he knew, which was not technical. He was not a handler. He told her about picking the egg up out of the mud, about sitting still in the dark while Soot settled on him, about 30 days of nothing more sophisticated than being present, being steady, not needing the dragon to be anything other than what she was. Corval was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "That's everything. That's all of it, and we buried it under doctrine because doctrine is easier to teach than that." "What is it?" Osric asked. "What do you call it?" "I used to call it patience," she said, "but that's not right either. Patience is waiting for something to end. This is staying without needing it to change." She looked at Soot. "That's what she found in you. That's what she told Vren in the gorge. I can hear the register now that I know what I'm listening for." What happened after that moved slowly, the way things that actually last always do. Corval went back to Drathan's camp. Osric did not know what she told him. 2 weeks later, the conditions on Vren's care changed. Corval wrote to tell him this in 3 careful sentences. She did not over-explain. She was not a woman who over-explained. In Belhaven, Soot kept growing. She outgrew the common room, which Petra accepted with the equanimity of someone who had seen stranger things, and kept the door open in the mornings so Soot could put her head inside and watch the breakfast crowd. The children came every day. Bevan had decided he would be a dragon handler when he grew up, and was conducting research toward this goal by following Soot everywhere she went and recording her behaviors in a notebook with his tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration. Henwick started teaching people in the Eastern Valley towns what Belhaven had done in the gorge, not the specific plan, which worked only once, but the principle underneath it, which was, do not fight with what you don't have, fight with what you do, know your ground, know their limits, know your own. It spread the way things spread when they are useful, slowly, town by town. Osric stayed in Belhaven. He did not plan to. He had arrived going somewhere else. But he had no particular reason to leave and a number of reasons to stay, and he had learned, in the last several months, to pay more attention to the reasons he had than the ones he was looking for. He took a room, not at the Bent Nail. Petra charged fairly but consistently, and he was not a permanent guest. He found a house at the edge of town with a wide yard, which Soot needed, and a room with one window that faced east and caught the morning light. He fixed the door, which had a broken hinge, and the chimney, which smoked. He planted something in the yard that Petra told him would grow well in valley soil. Soot grew. She was not a weapon, she was not a symbol, she was not, in the manner of stories that want clean endings, a sign of a new age or proof of a changed world. The world had not changed. Drathen was still Drathen. There were still 3 conditioned dragons in his camp and 2 years of burned towns in his history. But there was also this. A 30-day-old hatchling had stood in a gorge and spoken to an 11-year-old war dragon in the language that sits underneath language, and the war dragon had chosen to leave. And a man who knew how to be still had taught something ancient that it still had a choice. Not by fighting, not by winning, by being, steadily and without apology, the kind of thing that other things could safely stop beside. That was the whole lesson. It was small and it was enormous, and it was, in the end, the only kind of victory that actually holds.